Imagine for a moment you inherited a $1 million home in one of the most well sought after communities in all of the country, or at least in a particular area, Flushing, Queens, New York. Imagine you inherited that home from within your family. And imagine just as you were about to sell this home that you lived in for a little bit, the moment you tried to sell it, the moment you put the for sale sign up on the door, a group of people just moved in, barged in, and when you told them to leave several times, and they refused to leave, and then you called the cops, you were the one getting arrested, and they were the ones whose rights were invoked. This is the story of Adele Andaloro, who is a homeowner in New York, who basically had the same exact thing happen to her. Unfortunately, Adele is not the only person who had this thing happen to her. There have been other people that have been dealing with the same exact thing, and some of their stories ended much more tragically. For example, there was a woman in New York whose mother had died, and she came in from out of the country, from Spain, to go in and assess the condition of her mother's property. This woman, Nadia Vittel, was killed by two squatters who had taken up, I would say illegally, but under New York law it's actually illegal, who had immorally taken up residence in her mother's house, and then when she came in, they beat her dead. She had just lost her mother, and then she goes in to try to get the house ready for someone else to stay. And these two men decide to beat her dead. And of course, there is no sign of these men. There is a squatters crisis racking the country, happening in cities, in big urban cities across the country, especially cities that are left-wing and have particular laws in place as it relates to homeownership and as it relates to the ability of the homeowner to actually defend their property against those who seek to do them or their property harm, or who seek to have a domicile there that is not quite just. Now, in the case of Andaloro, who we're going to go back to since she was the first one that I mentioned, she was defended in a sense by a group of vigilantes who did their best to try to evict these squatters from her $1 million home. In fact, one of those vigilantes said, "We are looking to get this guy out," quote, "I am here to talk to him, and I want to see why he is here." Now, this story, by the way, the vigilantes were not treated to go by the police, but this story brings to mind to me three central questions that all thinking people and everyone who loves America and wishes to be morally consistent must ask themselves when they think of these matters, whether you are left-wing or right-wing. If you are a property owner, or if you desire to be a property owner, or if you are someone that understands the importance of property rights to a flourishing society, there are three primary areas I want to take you through as I analyze this issue. Number one, I want to ask the question, what does the principle of justice enable individuals to do when the law refuses to carry out justice on its own? When the law, as it is stated, rebels against what is moral, where is the role of vigilantism in that particular context? Number two, how has the anti-property sentiments that we have seen in American political discourse for over 120 plus years, even more than that has taken root in forms of laws and other kinds of policies across America, federally and locally, how has that sentiment played into creating this crisis? And of course, number three, what is the false category of rights created for squatters, which give them the ability to usurp your control over your own home in the name of their own subsistence? Let's actually begin with number three, because it's actually quite interesting. Because number three is the most perplexing and the most offensive to me, not just as an American, but also as a thinking person who I believe has a good understanding of what rights are and what they are not. And using this understanding, I have seen how leftists and progressivists have perverted the idea of rights, created this zombified version of them, and then they have sicked this zombified version upon innocent people, all to achieve their own political agenda, which has no moral grounding. Indeed, the men who were in Miss Andaloro's home, they were quite literally kept there, according to the police, under the idea of squatters' rights. I'll read from the article. It says, quote, "The homeowner was charged with unlawful eviction So she was charged with unlawfully evicting the two men that had moved in when she tried to sell the home that she inherited that was in her name, because she had changed the locks and had not provided a new key to the person staying there. Now, just by reading this sentence, you would think, okay, was this person an actual tenant? No, they are someone who came in there without the imprimatur of the homeowner, the person who inherited the property, who owns the property, who has the deed in their name, and they decided to just live there. Well, in New York, that person has rights. I continue. Quote, in New York City, a person can claim squatter's rights after just 30 days of living at a property. Under the law, it is illegal for the homeowner to change the locks, turn off the utilities, or remove the belongings of the tenants from the property. Quote, by the time someone does their investigation, their work, and their job, it will be over 30 days, and this man will still be in my home. These are the sentiments of the homeowner. She continues, I'm really fearful that these people are going to get away with stealing my home. It should be known that in the case of Andelaro, her entire community, who've been there for a very, very long time, are doing their best to try to get the men out, but there is no legally actionable things they can do beyond going through a bogged down bureaucratic court process because of this vain notion of squatters' rights. Now, it's going to be very easy to accuse the government of New York of not caring about their citizens, and in many respects it's probably true, especially if you consider just the nature of the crime that is happening in New York City, the nature of the complete and utter burdensome taxation that has driven many businesses out of New York State and into greener pastures elsewhere. But regardless of that, there's a much deeper conversation to be had here about the nature of rights and how a lack of moral education in this nation has quite literally left the population vulnerable to policymakers who themselves reject the correct version of rights and substitute their own philosophy of rights into law, which then therefore hurts everybody as it's hurting this woman right now. We have to ask ourselves, my friends, what is a right? Well, under the classical American understanding of what a right is, which comes from the broader natural law tradition, particularly the Enlightenment natural law tradition, headed by men like Hugo Grotius and John Locke, a right is a property of your human being, which enables you to exist in society, it enables you to be an ethical person, and it enables you to be morally responsible amongst your fellow citizens. It is literally an inborn quality of your person that is as integral to your existence as your ability to breathe. This is the doctrine known as natural rights. This doctrine implies some very important things, but chief among those things is that every man is self-owning, and that every man's rights do not come from government or any other external entity that's outside of himself. Man's rights instead come from nature, which, if you want to go even further, some would say they come from God. I won't get into that debate. I'm a Christian, but that's a different debate, different time. You don't have to be a Christian to accept this premise. They come from a source outside of government, and they are morally instructive for government, because not only do rights enable me to be a morally responsible person, they also put limits on what the government and what people in society can do to me without running athwart of sound moral action. Now, under that system of rights, which was built into the constitutional ethos of our country, there is absolutely no way in hell that this kind of squatters' rights category could even be created. Why not? Because squatters' rights aren't rights whatsoever. They are privileges and permissions granted by the government for some asinine reason, which usurp the natural right of property ownership from the person who actually owns the property. They are of a different nature of the rights that Americans know, love, and enjoy, because they're not rights at all. They are illegitimate permissions enabled by law and nothing else. But under this new category of rights that comes from the Rousseauian idea of rights, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher during the Enlightenment, which says that rights don't just enable you to act morally. Rights are indeed kind of like permissions, because they grant you things that you need for life. They grant you health care. They grant you a job, so on and so forth. This category of positive rights, unfortunately, influences how a lot of left-wing jurisdictions view these kinds of matter, how they view property, how they view individuals, and it oftentimes has bad consequences. But beyond the consequences, this idea of rights is erroneous. It is a slap in the face to the American ethos, and it is a corruption of moral theory. Because if the government can give me something, it can take it away. If society can give me something, it can take it away. And the more pernicious idea here is this. If rights are something that is given to me, then my ability to be a moral person is not something that I'm responsible for, but rather the society is responsible into making me a moral person, into making me a virtuous person, into making me a nice person. So the fate of my life, by implication, depends entirely on what society does to me. Now, if this was the mentality that was actually true, America would have never existed, because before America, there was no other society quite like America that enabled the individual and put moral value in his own accomplishments as opposed to in status and into vain and dead hierarchies as America did. But again, it is this false alien idea of rights that has invaded America, has been put into law, has been exemplified through phrases like universal health care and others, and has corrupted the moral understanding of so many Americans, so much so that it leaves them vulnerable before this threat in the worst way possible. This problem is fundamentally a problem of moral education. As I mentioned before, the West has a problem of moral education that it must work out if it's going to save itself. America, most importantly, because America is the guiding light. America is the integral pusher, the integral progression of Western civilization to its logical conclusions. But so long as things like this happen and our core ideas are corrupted, we won't always be that. And for a long time, people argue we are not that for various reasons. Different story, different day. But then there's also, as I hinted in a moment ago, the anti-property sentiments that are integral to this idea. Now, we have to understand what I'm talking about. For the past 120 plus years, leftists have used several phrases to demean the wealthy, and particularly demean those who own property. And this has had downstream cultural effects in America. So for example, we've heard the phrases, tax the rich. We've heard the phrases, you need to pay your fair share. We've heard the phrases of public property. All of these things suggest that your ability to own property should be dependent in relation to your obligation that you supposedly have to broader society. Now let me ask you this question. How can you have an obligation to somebody who you're not connected to? When you view society as this grand organism that is beyond any of our experiences, beyond any of our connections, what you do is assume that I have a affiliation to something that I cannot possibly have an affiliation towards. First and foremost, I have an affiliation to my family, to those who I know, to those who I love, those who I enter in compact and covenant with. And therefore, my property is not at the disposal of anyone else but me, because no one else is connected to me as much as I am as me. But things like Occupy Wall Street and democratic politics, the inheritance tax, and other vestiges of progressivism that are meant to spread around what they call equality, going all the way back to the socialism of the 1930s and the New Deal. All of this has a strong anti-wealth and anti-property sentiment. Now, I think that these sentiments are indirectly on play here, because if you look at what's happening in jurisdictions like San Francisco, where they will quite literally allow you to steal property from convenience stores if it is beneath a certain dollar amount. I think in San Francisco it was like $700, something like that. You'll either see an antipathy towards property ownership, or you'll see an indifference towards property ownership. If you look on the activist level, there are a lot of leftists who enjoyed burning down cities and entire neighborhoods throughout the past few years to protest racial injustice, allegedly. And when they were told that they are actually burning down the very communities that they are supposed to be fighting for, many of them responded, "It's just property. You have insurance, don't you?" You cannot remove or de-emphasize the role property hatred plays in jurisdictions who are run by ideologies that tend to be opposed to property ownership and therefore prioritize the rights of those who are not in your property, who have no connection to your property, over you, who does have connection to your property. So not only do we have a crisis of moral understanding, we also have a crisis of hatred and vitriol, which is seeping its way, or has already rather seeped its way into society, and is reflecting its way in politics. That's rather concerning. And we need to really talk about that. Because if you don't have self-ownership, you don't have a society. Because every man comes into society under the auspices of his own free will, under his own ability to own himself and act intelligibly, act rationally, and act freely. But the moment you say, no, your property is public, or the moment you say, no, your property, the status of it will be decided by the government and not by you, is the moment you deprive man of the fundamental principle that actually connects him to society. This is why you see a lack of social cohesion in the many major cities, because the ideologies and the laws that are in those cities don't emphasize it and attack the very principles that enable it. But then, of course, we have the fundamental problem that I first mentioned. And the fundamental problem is this, my friends: the necessity of vigilantism when the law does not do its job. I mentioned that America was founded upon a sense of natural rights. Well, natural rights come from natural law, and natural law is simply these moral rules that we can deduce from reality that are intelligible, that have been universal throughout history, even if they have not been recognized, and that when put into effect can lead to social harmony. And one of those basic social natural laws is the law of justice. It's simply the law that safeguards your property, your contracts, your oaths, your promises, and your person from those who seek to do it harm. If we imagine a society without actual justice, not social justice, which is a perversion of actual justice, but an actual justice, we can only imagine a society where chaos and unrequited crime is rampant, property is not held to be sacred, it is taken, murder happens because there's no constraining principle. So when the moral law establishes society, the positive law, the law of the government, is meant to preserve that moral law, or is meant to enact it as much as possible in a simple and concise way. Well, when the positive law, the law created by governments, doesn't actually follow morality, but it follows the arbitrary ideologies and the alien ideas of those who are in policy, then what you have here is an illegitimate law that is no longer serving its proper purpose. This is why when people ask me, Christian, do you believe in the rule of law? I believe in the rule of just law. If a law is unjust, it has no moral backing. And if it has no moral backing, how can I, in good conscience, as a conservative, as someone that wishes to conserve America, defend a law that harms America and tears it apart? I can't. So the rule of just law can be the only standard that a moral person accords himself to under any standard whatsoever. So when vigilantes go into these homes and say, look, you need to go out, they are acting justly because they are acting in defense of someone else's property, in other words, in someone else's rights. So in my opinion, the individual's role when he pursues justice should be as energetic, and it should be as passionate, and it should be as wide as possible. And if the authorities would arrest people who wish to defend their own property, let them arrest you. Because ultimately, the authorities do not set the standard. The authorities are supposed to enforce the standards. But if the authorities are given bad standards to enforce, they will themselves be enforcers of bad standards. So it's not the authorities you need to be looking at. It's the moral authority of your conscience that you should be looking for validation. And when you get that, you go for it. And if enough people in a community will support you, no matter how many times you get put in handcuffs, no matter how many times you get locked up, you will ultimately be vindicated. We have to act with moral consistency, even when it is the tough thing to do. We have to act with philosophical rigor, even when it is the tough thing to do. There's also another problem here that I haven't mentioned quite yet. And it's the problem of more generally, our government enabling criminals and liars by not adhering to first principles, by not caring about its own people, enabling criminals and liars to take advantage of the kindness of the American people. Here's a TikToker who is trying to explain to his people through his language how to come in and get more American homes by invading them. Go.
Mi gente, he pensado invadir una casa en United States, ya que me enteré que existe una ley que dice que si una casa no está habitada, podemos expropiarla. Capichi, muchachos, aquí en United States también se aplica la de invasión de terreno. Y creo que ese será mi próximo negocio. Invadir casas abandonadas, ya que me he buscado unos códigos con mis amigos africanos y me dijeron que ya llevan como 7 casas expropiadas. Y como dice el dicho, papi, hay que buscar la vuelta.
Wow. Now, in my opinion, hearing his words, he's basically trying to get people to do something that is ultimately just not correct morally. And for that reason alone, this individual should probably be investigated. He should probably be indicted as well. You don't get to do this. It's absolutely not correct. But also, it incentivizes a kind of carelessness for other people's property when the law refuses to defend it. So in some ways, I can't really look at this person, this TikToker, and condemn him too harshly, because he is simply doing what the law wants him to do. But in other ways, I can and I will condemn him harshly, because he's trying to incentivize people to continue to come into communities, invade them, and violate the social cohesion that is there, violate the owner's property rights, all by taking over things that don't belong to them. This is a crisis, my friends. This crisis will continue. More people will die. More people will continue to inhabit homes that are not theirs. More people will continue to have to fight for their homes, which they shouldn't have to do, until we demand more from our leaders, until we demand more from our politicians, and until we demand more from ourselves, and until we begin to understand where our rights come from, where our morality is supposed to come from, and how rights and moral action should influence our actions towards those who have no care for them. Until we actually fix these problems that I've mentioned, I'm afraid this issue will keep going. It'll get worse, and we will continue to see a downward spiral for the communities of our country. But if we do the things that I'm suggesting, if we rediscover our moral core, and we are more energetic towards evicting people who have no care for our communities out of homes that they should not be in, regardless of what the police have to say about it, then I think there may be hope yet for our country. My friends, let us fight the trifecta of evils that are property hatred, that is the creation of false categories of rights, and that is discouraging moral action when the law refuses to undertake it on its own. And let us instead embrace a proactive viewpoint and approach to these issues so that our country, our community, and our foundational principles remain affirmed, righteous, and triumphant. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Be sure also to donate to me if you want to. Donate to me on my PayPal, my Patreon, all that good stuff in the comment section down below. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.